Hello, friends. Today we're taking a look at Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. I've decided to divide this chapter because it's such an important one into two videos, so we're looking at verses 1 through 12 today. And as we begin Romans chapter 14, as you can see, Paul is addressing a problem, isn't he? It's a problem that surely existed in the first century church in general, made up as it was with Gentile Christians as well as Jewish Christians, but it's very likely a problem that was real for the church at Rome. Now, what was the nature of that problem? Well, what the specific problem was is a bit unclear. It likely was a problem that pitted Jewish Christians against Gentile Christians and Gentile Christians against Jewish Christians. Paul seems to be addressing a problem between two groups in the church, doesn't he? The first group is despising the second group, and the second group is judging or condemning the first group. So, what is the underlying problem? It is disunity and disharmony in the church. Paul's interest in this chapter is unity and the acceptance of those whose opinions differ from one's own. What he really is after is the unity of a Gentile Jewish Christian church. That's what he's after. Now, let's talk about these two groups as he describes them in Romans chapter 14. The first group believes it's okay to eat anything. Those in this group, for example, feel they can eat meat with God's approval. To the members of this group, what does Paul write? You must not despise those who abstain or who do not agree with your opinion. Then there is another group, the members of the second group. They do not believe it is okay to eat meat. Perhaps it was meat that had been offered to idols, for this was the context that Paul addressed in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, remember? Or perhaps the members of this second group were Jewish Christians who felt they were still bound by the dietary laws of the law of Moses. Whoever the members of this second group were, they believed that eating certain foods was disapproved by God, and to them Paul writes, "You who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat those foods." So, it appears that Paul is addressing two groups of people in the church at Rome. Now, what does he instruct these two groups to do? Well, if you'll take a look at verse 1, he says, I want you to welcome one another, or I want you to accept one another. He says, I don't want you to quarrel over opinions. And then if you'll take a look at verse 3, he says, I don't want you to despise one another for the opinions that others hold. I don't want you to judge one another on the basis of these opinions. That's his instruction to these two groups. Now, what does he say? He says, who are you to pass judgment on the servants of another? Those servants are not accountable to you, he writes. It is before God's judgment seat that they will stand, not before yours, verse 10. They are accountable to their Lord, verse 12. In fact, each of you will be accountable to God, Paul writes in verse 12. No servant has a right to condemn another man's servant. His standing or falling is entirely between him and his Lord. And in the end, it is only God's verdict that counts. Now that's what Paul writes. In verses 7 through 9, Paul writes that followers of Jesus cannot cut themselves off from any connection with the Lord, and they live their own lives as they please. They can't do that. They can't live their own lives as they please because they answer to the Lord. Paul declares, we do not live to ourselves, in life and in death. We followers of Jesus are His. We are His servants, and we will answer to Him. And by the way, let it be known that those who eat, Paul writes, eat in honor of the Lord, and those who abstain from eating certain foods do so in honor of the Lord. That's verse 6. So, the motivation for eating or not eating is honorable and right. So, as far as these matters are concerned, in this context, in the realm of opinions, there should not be any judging or despising of one's brothers or sisters going on. Now, I do believe that we should leave these instructions in their context, don't you? It seems to me that Paul's injunction against judging must be confined to the kind of matters he was discussing. Jesus told us to beware of false prophets, didn't he? Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. How could one beware of false prophets unless he first judged them to be false prophets? And we must judge a man to be an evil worker before we could obey Paul's command in Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, to beware of evil workers. And judgments would have to be made for us to obey Romans 16, verses 17 and 18, and 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 6 through 15, for example. So, Paul is not prohibiting the making of all judgments. But what he says here in Romans 14 is that we are not to judge one another or despise one another in the matter of opinions that one may hold. Now, does this message speak to us? Does it apply to us? Well, sure it does. Are we ever guilty of quarreling over opinions, of passing judgment on one another over opinions, of despising or looking down with contempt upon one another because of the opinions that one may hold? Is there ever the possibility that our opinions can become preferences, and then our preferences can become traditions, and then traditions can become rules which we try to bind on one another? Well, of course there is that tendency, there is that possibility. So there is a warning here in this text, even for us, wouldn't you say? We will have more to say about this problem in our next video together as we finish Romans chapter 14. But for now, I think that's enough. I just wanted to give us some kind of an idea what I thought this text was talking about and how it surely applies to us. And I hope that you can see that this may be the number one problem in the Roman church that Paul is trying to address in this letter. And so it makes sense that he wants to explain the doctrine of justification by faith as he addresses this particular problem, because he wants his readers to see that they are not judged by God on the basis of their works, and they're not saved by God on the basis of their works. They're saved on the basis of their faith, and so they ought to accept one another on that basis, not whether or not they subscribe to a set of opinions which the other group holds. Okay, enough for today. God bless you, and I'll see you next week in a few days.